Now we move to a discussion of Israel. As many of you may know, the Israeli government is holding its fifth election in fewer years than that to try to determine who will lead the next government. Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to win back power. What are the results? What's happening there? Why has the Israeli government held so many elections? And what does this mean for the Palestinian people, for their freedom, and for their pursuit of justice? To discuss these issues and more, we're happy to welcome on our very special guest, Mr. Richard Silverstein, who many of you know is an author, journalist, and he writes for Tikun Olam, and he's been a prominent commentator on these issues for so many years. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Richard, first, give us a little background for those who haven't been following Israeli politics. What has been going on there the past several years in terms of these elections happening over again, the political situation? Give us a little primer on what's been going on.
Well, this is the fifth election in 3 years, and the state of Israeli politics has really been a stalemate. They've gone back and forth between a center-right coalition, which is in power now, and a far-right wing coalition, which is the one that appears that it's won a victory in the election, as far as the exit polls show right now. It's a triumph of the far right, as I mentioned. It's a triumph of what I call Judeo-fascism, because the farthest right political parties, the ones that advocate actually not just settlement enterprise, but actually violence, outright, explicit violence against Palestinians, they've doubled their results since the most recent elections. So we're going to have not just a far-right government, but we're going to have ministers who, for the first time, they'll probably be associated with security ministries, which are the ones that govern settlements, and they govern also the way the state reacts to the Palestinians, both in the occupied territories and in Israel itself. And this really means a decline in what little rights the Palestinian minority is going to have. And it really bodes ill, I think, for democracy and for the Palestinians.
So, Richard, why have there been so many elections? It sounds like you're describing it's been election after election, a fight among people on the right. Who's going to be worse than Palestinians than the other person? Why have there been so many elections? And what role is Mr. Netanyahu played in these successive elections happening so quickly?
Well, I think there is basically a stalemate between what I call the center right, which is sort of like fascism light, if you wish, and it advocates. The only difference between far right Likud and them is that they're a little bit softer on issues of Palestinians. They're a little bit more secular in their orientation, and they're a little less militaristic, I would say, in foreign policy. But they're so close in the level of support that that's why everything is sort of like teetered towards one or the other. And really, right now, what we have is an outright decision on the part of the electorate that they're going to go farther to the right than with the center-right coalition that's in power right now. And
Well,
one thing I should
go
add
ahead.
is that Netanyahu represents a unique kind of politician in Israeli politics, because he doesn't have any ideological framework. He's not religious, he's secular, but he's made this alliance with the far right, with the ultra-religious, ultra-Orthodox, and he's served so far for 15 years. This will be his sixth term as prime minister, but he doesn't really represent any strong ideological base, although his alliance with the far right sort of means all of his governments are tilting in that direction. So he's a man without ideology and a man without principle, I should mention. His only principle is to preserve his own power. And in our society, democracy is an end result, is something that we're all striving for, whereas BBC's democracy as something that entitles him to continue his rule, his long-term rule of the country.
So that brings me to my next question. The results of this particular election, Netanyahu was tossed out of power in the last election. What do you expect to happen today? What are the exit polls showing? And if it does hypothetically turn out to be Mr. Netanyahu, who might his partners in government be? And on the flip side, if for some reason it's not him, it's Mr. Lapid or the other party, who might their partners be? And tell us about that.
Well, the exit polls, the polls prior to the election showed the far right coalition winning 59 votes, and there's 60 in the Knesset. So anybody who wins an election has to have 61 seats. The exit polls actually are giving him 2 extra seats from the prior ones. And so he now seems to have 61 votes, and therefore he has a majority, and he's going to be forming the next government as long as the exit polls hold true. And I don't see any reason why they won't. That means that we, as I mentioned, a far-right government, but explicitly it means that Bezalel Smotrich, who is a former Jewish terrorist, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who runs all of the Jewish terrorist operations that have happened against Palestinians in the West Bank. I shouldn't say he runs them, but he's the reputed leader of the far right extremist factions that engage in terrorism against Palestinians. So we're going to have those 2 figures playing key roles and they're going to get ministerial posts for the first time ever in their history. So we're going to have former Jewish terrorists actually running parts of the government. And Netanyahu has really created a monster because he's the one who created the coalition that is going to get these 14 votes that's going to enable him to be in power. But the question is whether he's going to be able to exert any control over them, because they really have their own agenda, which is far more violent than Netanyahu's agenda. And they may just be, out of control once they take power. And it really bodes ill for the rule of law in Israel. And as I said, democracy is going to be totally hollowed out. Right now, Netanyahu faces a corruption trial and 4 different charges. The trial seems to have stalled. If he had been convicted, he wouldn't actually legally be allowed to be prime minister. It appears with its new majority, he'll be able to pass laws that actually end the trial and give him impunity. So Israel becomes a state that no longer has a rule of law and no longer has democracy, and in which Judeo-fascism really rules.
So, what does this mean for the Palestinian people? Because it would seem they suffer no matter who is prime minister. We saw some horrific incidents occur since Netanyahu left, horrific killings of Palestinian children and other civilians, and that was happening when he was the prime minister. So, can you speak to what change there might be for the Palestinian people inside and outside of Israel's internationally recognized borders?
The irony of the current government, the center-right government, is that there have been more Palestinians killed this year than ever before since maybe the first Intifada. We'd have to go back to 1997. So 150 Palestinians have been murdered just this year by Israeli forces. So I would say if Ben-Gvir and Smotrich enter the cabinet, we're going to have a far worse situation. They will be controlling the dynamic and controlling Israeli policy in that area. So I think that it really is going to be a bad situation, both for Palestinians in the West Bank and for Palestinians in 48 Palestine. Those within Israel are already discriminated against harshly in all forms of life. There's going to be motivation to either expel Palestinians from Israel, Palestine, or to make life so miserable that they'll be under the heel of the government and the right-wing government even more than they have been.
Well, another question for you, Richard. What do you think Netanyahu's return would mean for U.S.-Israel relations? Because it's no secret that the Democratic establishment, in particular the Biden administration, Obama holdovers, preferred Mr. Lapid to Netanyahu, and they seem to bend over backwards to try to give the Israeli government a lot of leeway so that Mr. Netanyahu would not return. And it appears that is going to happen anyway. So do you see any potential change in relationships there, or is this going to be business as usual?
Well, under Obama, you'll recall that the relations between Netanyahu and the U.S. government then were frigid at best. Netanyahu hated Obama, and Obama hated Netanyahu. Obama's hatred, I think, is quite justified. And we still have a Democratic president now in Joe Biden, and Biden doesn't have any better relations with Netanyahu than Obama did. So it means that we're going to have a very frosty relationship. I think the direction of U.S. policy is going to be even more hands-off than it has been under the first 2 years of Biden. So the U.S. is not going to want to be involved in any intimate way with Israel-Palestine. It's going to be turning its direction towards China and issues like that. And that bodes ill, I think, for the left-wing progressive forces in Israel, such as they are. And it means that Netanyahu has an even freer rein to impose this really repressive direction that I think he'll be taking. Yeah.
I have a theory for you, Richard. I want to know what you think. So, in America, we've seen this huge tug of war in recent years between establishment Democrats who are indifferent to Palestinian suffering and more liberal Democrats, especially the younger generation, who have really been making a push to make concern about Palestinian human rights part of the Democratic platform. And Netanyahu's hostility to President Obama, what many would say was a racist hostility to the first black president, followed by horrific war crimes that were committed by the Israeli government on TV that people saw, really started to cause a bit of a break in the kind of democratic establishment support for Israel. Netanyahu leaving, I think, made it easier for the democratic establishment to come back and just kind of lockstep support whatever the Israeli government did because it didn't have him there. Do you think his return might actually make it harder for that sort of unity to be maintained? Might his return and the negative feelings about him among liberals actually make it easier for Palestinians to make their case in this country for freedom, for justice, for a change in U.S. foreign policy?
Well, there are a couple of factors I think trends going to be working here. Talking about the American Jewish community, of which I'm a part, profound alienation from Israel, profound alienation from this Judeo-fascist direction that it's going in. And I think if the Jewish community lessens its support for Israel, it's going to make it actually easier for the Democrats to move a little bit farther to the left. And we should mention that the Democratic position now isn't that progressive on Israel and Palestine. But I think it will incrementally be able to move in a farther left direction. You're going to have Bernie Sanders, Rashida Tlaib, and people like that, Ilhan Omar, are going to be able, I think, to take a slightly more left-wing progressive position on these issues because they're not going to get as much pushback from most of the American Jewish community. That doesn't mean that the leadership of the Israel lobby is going to fall into the background at all. But if anything, they'll be reinforcing their attempts to maintain the status quo and keep attacking pro-Palestine candidates, as AIPAC has been doing with the tens of millions they've been funneling into congressional races and senatorial races. But I think the momentum is moving away from Israel overall in American politics. And I don't think it's going to be a revolutionary change or a radical overnight change, but I think it's going to be moving in that direction over time.
Well, Richard, obviously the election results there are coming in. A lot of people watching them here and in the region. We thank you for joining us to share some of your perspective and thoughts, and we look forward to having you back to discuss more about this ongoing issue, which is relevant not only to our country, not only to the Israeli public, obviously to the Palestinian people as well. Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.